So I think for a long time, when we celebrate Easter and the resurrection, speaking for myself, for a long, long time I always thought it was all about Jesus. And so lately I've come, thank God, to realize that it's not all about Jesus, but the resurrection includes all of us here. Why do I say that? Well, if you go back to before the resurrection, and you've got to keep in mind that Jesus was fully human. He was a full human being in every sense of the word. And we kind of forget that. Well, he was human, but he was God. No, look at Jesus the human. And it was Jesus the human, just like you or I, who died on the cross. Now, we know he was totally human, because if we go back to Holy Week and the agony in the garden, because he was facing something terrible in his life, and he was in serious trouble at this stage, and he knew, as he himself said, that my hour is coming. So for a moment, if you pause there, and suppose you get some very bad news. So suppose you go for a checkup, or you're not feeling well, and you discover that you have some very serious disease or illness, that you have cancer. You're going to be suddenly terrified, aren't you? You're going to be very upset. And so Jesus in the agony in the garden, we know that's why it's called the agony in the garden. He went through awful trauma, upset, terror. But, and this is the important part of the resurrection that we rarely mention and don't often think about. But he made a commitment to trust in the Lord, to trust in God, his Father. And because of that, he didn't flinch. So he surrendered to God. And that was a big part of the resurrection. And that's where you and I come in. That often we are faced with a very traumatic situation in our lives. Apart from ourselves, maybe those we love and most care for are seriously ill, or we lose a loved one, and we're wondering how we're going to cope. And still we do. In some way or other, we get a strength. And so the important question is not, when we look at the resurrection, does it prove that Jesus is God? But the more important question is to ask is God for me? Can I really trust in God? That's the question that most comes up in our mind. Can I really trust in God that he won't let me down? You have to believe that God is turning all our own individual crucifixions into life. That is very, very true. In other words, God never lets anything go to waste. And it's not by chance, but it's very significant that in the last couple of days during the masses during the week, we had the parable of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves. I love that particular parable. And the most important part of that parable for me personally is what Jesus said to the apostles when everybody had enough. He said, gather up the fragments left over. Let nothing go to waste. And so, all the little fragments in our life, all the pains, the disappointments, the sufferings, and sometimes big, big sufferings, believe me and trust me when I say, God will never let one of those go to waste. Never. And that's comes through so much in the resurrection. And also, there's another aspect to we're all included in the resurrection. And it is this, that when Jesus rose when Jesus was raised from the dead as a human, that God too will raise us. And also it's interesting, and something I often talk about at a funeral. We're told that Jesus was with the two disciples on the way to Emmaus, on the way, on our way, in our lives. That's the meaning, interpretation of on the way, involved in their lives. And he was chatting and talking to them. And then they appeared, they came back all excited to the 11 disciples and said, we met Jesus and we recognized him in the breaking of bread. And suddenly the 11 disciples locked up in the room were still a bit disbelieving. But suddenly Jesus is there in their presence. Now what does that say? There's a beautiful consequence to that story. Now that Jesus, having been raised from the dead, has a universal presence. He can be here and he can be out there. In other words, he can be everywhere. Everywhere. And then he says to them, they were frightened, and he says, I'm not a ghost. Look at me. Touch me. I am a real person. Touch me. Look. And to prove it, he said, like you or I would say, I'm hungry. Have you got anything to eat? And we're told, before their very eyes, he ate a piece of fish. It's me. No worries. And so I often share to people at a funeral, when you die, or I die, what is left is our remains. So if you have been cremated, the ashes are your remains. If you're in a casket, what is in the casket is your remains. But now, just like Jesus, you have a universal presence. So you don't leave those you love, but you're always beside them, even when you die. How consoling is that? How consoling is that? And that's something we find very hard to believe in. And so God is not, the real miracle of the resurrection then is not that God could raise a human from the dead, because God can do anything, but that Jesus is still alive today. And where is he? He's in two places. He's in each one of us. He's in my body, he's in your body, and of course he will be in a couple of moments' time in the Eucharist. So Jesus is everywhere. And we're never on our own. Even in our darkest moments, he's there beside us. And I nowadays, and I'm very glad to be able to share this, whatever happens in my life, good, bad, or indifferent, and what very often I don't understand why this happened or that happened, I smile and say, thank you, Lord. Because every single thing that happens in my life, I see as God's beautiful plan for me. And when I see it like that, I can face anything. I have a courage and a strength that doesn't come from me, but directly comes from the Lord. And if you can have that attitude, that whatever happens is part of God's beautiful plan. Now, there's a big difference in being resigned to the will of God. God doesn't want that. He doesn't want you to be resigned to the will of God, but he wants you to accept it joyfully. And when you see everything as God's beautiful plan, you can do that. And even in your pain and your suffering and your crucifixions, to be able to say, thank you, thank you, thank you, Lord. That's real gratitude. And I think that that's our salvation. Real gratitude for everything. Not just for the good things, but for all things. Total gratitude.